Hello, welcome everyone. I'm going to wait just a few seconds here as folks roll in. Welcome, welcome. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. It's a big crowd today, so just going to let everyone file in. While you're waiting, if you could take a moment and share your name and organization and location in the chat so we can see who's with us today, that'd be awesome. We're about to blow up the chat. All right, I'll get started in just a few more seconds here. Thanks for joining, everyone. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining today for our fourth installment of our Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance webinar series. We'll be talking about the National Floodplain Assessment. I've been asking folks to take a moment and share their name and organization and location in the chat just so we can see who all is with us today. We would love to hear from you during the webinar. Ideally, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A or we'll take questions at the end. We'll save the chat just for introductions. If you have any issues using the Q&A function, you can go ahead and use the chat. That's fine too. And just so you know, this webinar will be recorded and placed on the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance website within a week. And just a heads up that at the end of this webinar, we'll be asking you to fill out a brief survey for us. It will take less than 5 minutes. So it's a really helpful way to better serve y'all for future webinars. Please take a moment if you can. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce myself and the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance before I pass the mic to our speakers. My name is Lacey Davis. I'm the Associate Director of Floodplain Restoration for American Rivers. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, on traditional homelands of Muskogee and Creek peoples, and I work nationally to advance floodplain restoration and protection. One of my primary roles at American Rivers is facilitating the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance. I'm really excited always to put these webinars on and share out the really awesome work that folks are doing. So the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance, if you're not familiar with it already, is an affiliation of over 2,500 nonprofit and private organizations, governments, agencies, and individuals dedicated to the protection and preservation of the natural functions of river and coastal floodplains. Check out our website. This QR code should take you directly there. You could utilize our resource library that we're always adding to. Sign up for our monthly newsletter, which includes policy updates, other webinars and conferences, case studies of floodplain restoration projects. So please check that out. If you're not already a member, it's free to become a member. And then I want to give a shout out to our steering committee. We have folks who meet monthly from each of these organizations listed to advance our mission and goals. So really grateful for their work. And then briefly just want to talk about some of the work we have been doing in the last year. If you missed it, we've hosted 3 webinars so far since October of 2024. The first one was focusing on the current state of clean water protections. In January of 2025, we heard from Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance members who work directly with frontline communities most affected by flood risk. And then our recent April webinar focused on state integrated floodplain management. And today, of course, we'll be talking with American Rivers and conservation science partners staff about the National Floodplain Assessment, which quantifies the degree of floodplain protection and alteration across the US. So if you missed any of these past webinars and you want to check them out, you can on our website view them all. And want to give a big thanks to our funders, the Walton Family Foundation and the Kresge Foundation, for supporting our work. Also, coming up in October of this year, we'll be launching our next series. So we're still finalizing what that's going to look like. We have gotten a lot of feedback from y'all already about things you're interested in learning about, so appreciate that. So keep a lookout on our newsletters for more information about that. And with that, I will introduce our speakers today. Eileen Shader is the Senior Director for Floodplain Restoration at American Rivers. She joined American Rivers in 2006 and leads the floodplain restoration program efforts to restore 20,000 acres of floodplains by 2027. Eileen works with regional and national partners to transform federal floodplain policies and is leading our 50-state strategy to expand the practice of floodplain restoration and equitable floodplain management in all states. She's a certified floodplain manager and holds a master's in environmental and resource policy from George Washington University. And Dr. Elise Comte is a lead scientist at Conservation Science Partners. She leads the Freshwater Solutions Lab, a program dedicated to advancing conservation science to inform the management and policy solutions to diverse challenges facing our freshwater. So thank you both so much for being here today. I want to also introduce Brandon Parsons, who also works in our floodplain protection and restoration team. He'll be here helping with any tech support that we need. With that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Eileen.
Thank you so much, Lacey, and welcome everybody. We're so excited to see such a robust attendance for this webinar, which is really exciting to see such interest. So as Lacey mentioned, I work with American Rivers. If you're not familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit that restores damaged rivers, protects wild rivers, and conserves clean water for people and nature. Next slide. We use 6 different conservation strategies in our efforts to protect and restore rivers. Hopefully, many of you have intersected with some of our staff throughout the country who work on clean water, dam removal, hydropower reform, river protection, a floodplain restoration program, and conservation partnerships. All of our efforts are aimed at building a robust movement for river conservation within the United States. As Lacey mentioned, I lead our floodplain restoration program. We have staff across the country that are working collectively to increase the pace and scale of floodplain restoration through policy reform at the national, state, and local level, implementing on-the-ground projects, and building capacity for our community of floodplain restoration practitioners, ourselves and all of you. Next slide. So why floodplains? A lot of the work that I am engaged in, the partners I'm engaged with are involved in the flood management space. And so I always find it helpful to remind folks that floodplains aren't just a place where floodwater goes. They are a necessary component of a healthy river. They are essential to safely conveying floodwater downstream. When rivers have access to their floodplains and floodwater can spread out, it can slow down, it can end up being less destructive. So the more floodplain we have protected and connected to our rivers, in the long run, the safer our communities will be. Floodplains are also the most productive and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. It is really that intersection of water and land that sparks all of the microbial and chemical and material exchanges that make them really productive ecosystems. And finally, as our floods are increasing in frequency and intensity, it's important that we keep increasing our efforts to protect floodplains and ensure that our rivers have enough access to low-lying land so that they can safely accommodate floodwaters and keep people safe. Next slide. So as I mentioned, a functional floodplain is able to perform the chemical, biological, physical processes that produce many benefits to society. You can keep clicking through There you go, Lacey. Whether it's water quality, sediment management, habitat for fish and wildlife, etc. But we have altered our floodplains dramatically across this country, across the globe. And the heavier that the human impact, the less function that those floodplain areas can have. Next slide. So how do we determine if a floodplain is functional or not? When we look at the scientific literature, points to 4 different attributes of a functional floodplain. First is it needs to be connected to the river stream around it. Second, it needs to experience variable flows in terms of the timing, the duration, the depth of inundation. Many of our floodplain dependent species have evolved their life cycles to the natural flood pulse that has existed within that location where they have evolved. Third, we need a variety of habitat and landscape features like permanent wetlands or higher ground for critters to retreat to during a flood. And finally, we need area of appropriate spatial scale to the reach of the river where a floodplain area may be located. If you can achieve those, then chances are you have a healthy floodplain. It's going to be functional. It's going to provide many benefits to society. In the US, we have depended for the last several decades on several federal standards and policies that we think are essential for protecting our undeveloped floodplains and trying to improve and restore floodplains moving forward. But they haven't been strong enough and they haven't been enforced enough. Prior to the current administration taking office, many of us in the floodplain space were working towards strengthening floodplain protections and ensuring that development could occur on, and it was encouraged to occur on higher ground, or at least be resilient to increasing floods. One of these policies intended to strengthen resilience was Executive Order 13690, the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. Unfortunately, that was rescinded when President Trump took office earlier this year. The Clean Water Act has also been really important at protecting floodplains through the dredge and fill permits. But one of the results of the Supreme Court cases on Sackett versus EPA is that floodplain wetlands on the dry side of levees and other structures without a clear surface connection are no longer considered jurisdictional. And we are worried about some of the other floodplain protections that we've traditionally relied on, like Executive Order 11988, which is the floodplain executive order, and Executive Order 11990, the wetlands executive order, both of those signed by President Carter back in the 70s. And we expect FEMA to come out with some recommendations for restructuring, including changes to the National Flood Insurance Program. So what's going to happen to minimum land use standards under the National Flood Insurance Program? That will help, if any changes to those could have a dramatic impact on how our local governments manage the floodplains under their jurisdiction. Next slide. So in order for American Rivers and our allies and other folks that are interested in this space to effectively defend strong standards, advocate for federal, state, and local floodplain management standards and policies, we need to be able to argue effectively for why functional floodplains and undeveloped floodplains are really important to our society. We need to have numbers that tell the stories about how much functional floodplain has been lost, what the impact of that loss has been on the places that decision makers care about. So a couple of years ago, the NFFA and our friends at the Wetland Mapping Consortium held a series of workshops. We ended up producing the report pictured on the left there, the strategies and action plan for protecting and restoring wetland and floodplain functions. I know that's a mouthful, but through that effort, we identified a number of different recommendations, policy, funding, data, communications, that we thought were necessary to keep this movement of floodplain protection and restoration moving forward. One of the big buckets was that we needed better data on the quantity and the value of functional floodplains, at many different scales. So we needed to be able to tell that national story of why floodplains are important to the nation. And we need to tell that story, the local stories of why a particular healthy floodplain is really important to protect and keep, and the value that it provides to society. So over the last year and a half, American Rivers had partnered with conservation science partners so we could start tackling that really high-level national story of the role of floodplains within the United States, how better understand how much we have left, how much has been protected, how much has been altered, how much needs to be restored, and how much has been restored over the last few decades. So I'm really excited to have Lise join us from Conservation Science Partners and walk through the nitty-gritty details of this assessment and how we hope to use some of this data in the future. So Lise, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Aileen. So as Aileen said, so we started like this partnership like about a year and a half ago. And the objective of our project was really to try to provide a nationwide assessment of floodplain protection and, importantly, alteration across the United States. The goal being really to galvanize efforts to restore the critical roles played by floodplains in flood mitigation, water purification, climate resilience, as well as critical habitat for both freshwater and terrestrial species. Next. And so the first question was, how can we quantify the extent of floodplain protection? And we know that floodplain protection can involve a variety of mechanisms. It really relies on a combination of regulatory frameworks, conservation policies, and management practices that are being implemented at a variety of scales, from national, state, tribal, and local governmental agencies, but as well as by private organizations. And which is important to consider when we think about floodplain protection is the fact that protection can be afforded both by freshwater specific mechanisms, but also by mechanisms targeting the protection of the land. Next. And so when we collected information regarding floodplain protection, we first focused on mechanisms conferring, like targeting the protection of freshwater systems. And first, we considered the category of the river-specific protection mechanisms that in general seek to preserve the free-flowing character of rivers and, importantly, the scenic value of surrounding land corridors, including the floodplains. Next. The more notable example of these mechanisms being the National Wide and Scenic River System. So you have represented on the map here the different designated river segments across the country with the associated corridors that are important for floodplain protection. Next. We also consider the variety of state-level wild and scenic rivers program that exist across the country. You have the examples here on the map. Next. As well as more sporadic efforts, more sporadic like protection mechanisms that in general focus on preserving key aspects of river systems. And here you have two examples. You have the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve that is located in West Virginia, and also the Buffalo Lake National River in Arkansas. Then we also consider the mechanisms targeting more specifically the riparian areas and the floodplains. And in general, these mechanisms of protection, they seek to protect, restore, or enhance water quality, floodplain functions, and biodiversity. The first mechanism that we considered were the state riparian buffers mandated through state laws and forestry regulatory best practices. So you have this data represented here. But we also considered other like mechanisms targeting like riparian and floodplains, such as the riparian conservation areas managed by local, state, or federal agencies, such as national conservation areas, or riparian easements, often around drinking water intake, so to protect like the quality of the water that we drink. And we also considered like floodplain easements as well as wetland reserves. Next. And we also considered the key watersheds of the Northwest Forest Plan, where targeted like management practices are being implemented to maintain freshwater ecological functions. And so these ones are located in the Pacific Northwest. Then we also consider the designation of critical habitat for endangered and threatened freshwater species under the Endangered Species Act. Next. And for that, we consider the critical habitat for 129 species of amphibians, reptiles, mollusks, crustaceans, and fish that can confer protection to floodplains. And then we considered the diversity of all the mechanisms conferring protection to the land, because we know that although many, if not most, terrestrial protected areas were not originally designed to protect river systems, the management objectives, they often align explicitly or implicitly with the conservation of freshwater resources, including floodplains. And so to do that, we organize all these like variety of terrestrial protection mechanisms into different categories. First, we focus on the protected areas associated with a GAP status, that is a measure of the management intent to conserve biodiversity or of 1 or 2, meaning that they confer permanent protection and they are primarily managed for biodiversity. And so we split these categories between like 2 categories of protection mechanisms. The first one that we call here the terrestrial protected areas strict, that usually allows only minimal like human uses, such as within wilderness areas, research natural areas, and national parks. Next. And then we considered the variety of other terrestrial protected areas where recreational and sustainable development goals are together with biodiversity targets, management targets. And there's like many different mechanisms like within this category, including the national wildlife refuges, many conservation areas, as well as conservation easements or state parks. Next. And then we considered additional like mechanisms of protection, the multiple use lands that confer permanent protection, but where extractive uses are being allowed. And we divided these lands classified as GAP status 3 between 2 different categories. The first one was, can you go back? Yeah, the multiple use with a specific management, where usually there's only like limited development that is being allowed, such as on the areas of critical environmental concern on BLM lands, or the inventoried like roadless areas on the US Forest Service lands. And then we considered all the other like multiple use lands where more like heavy extractive activities are taking place, such as logging and mining, the best example of these lands being the national forest and many conservation easements. Okay, so to sum up, we consider all these different mechanisms like being within 7 categories of protection that are being represented here. Next slide. And so what we did with all these like layers that we assembled with all these protection mechanisms is that we overlaid them with a layer of defining the extent of floodplains across the country. And just because we don't really have an agreed upon like definition of floodplain across the country, especially because floodplains are dynamic, we use like a geomorphic algorithm like to model the floodplains like across the country. Then we overlap the mechanisms of protection, and we could get a better understanding of the extent of protection of these local floodplains that we summarized across watersheds and states for the different categories of protection. And here is what we found. So here you have the extent of floodplain protection with all these mechanisms considered that are represented per watershed with a color indicating the percentage of protection. And so you have gray colors indicating a low degree of protection and the bluish colors like a high degree of protection. And so you can see first on the map that the degree of protection is like especially unbalanced, right? So you have areas in the western part of the country and on the east coast that display a higher degree of protection. But altogether, if we sum up everything, we found that 56.6 million acres are being currently afforded protection, like in the entire US, corresponding to 22% of all the floodplain area. And if we consider only the contiguous like US, so removing Alaska and Hawaii, we find that this number is even lower, corresponding to 38 million acres or 17% of the floodplains because of the contribution of Alaska to floodplain protection. Next. And so it's also possible to go back to these categories of mechanism and to think a little bit about which mechanisms confer protection to floodplains. And so you have here broken down the numbers, like for the US on the left and the contiguous US on the right, for the different categories of protection. And first we found that most of the protection is currently afforded by terrestrial-based protection mechanisms and not by freshwater specific ones, which is interesting. But if we think that multiple use lands, they might actually not confer a sufficient degree of protection to floodplains, and we remove them from this tally, we found that the current degree of protection afforded to floodplains is even lower, representing about 17% of all the floodplain area in the US and only 12% of the floodplain area in the contiguous US, which is very far away from national or international targets of protection, often of the 30% that we should achieve by 2030. Next. It's also possible to look at these numbers per state. So here you still have represented the floodplain area on the y-axis, and you have all the different states at the bottom. And you can see that there's indeed a lot of variability in terms of contribution of the different mechanisms of protection in different areas of the US, but there's also a lot of variability in terms of overall degree of protection. So you have represented, just as a reference, the 30% target in red, and you can see that very few states actually reach this target of 30% of floodplain area being protected, and that most states display a low degree of floodplain protection. But it varies a lot, right? You have states like Maryland, Delaware, Massachusetts presenting more than 50% of protection. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have states like New Mexico, Nebraska, Indiana, Texas, and Kansas displaying less than 5% of the floodplains being protected. Okay, so now that we have established what is the degree of protection of floodplains, we turn our gears to the extent of floodplain alteration. And so Aileen introduced what are the key aspects of a healthy floodplains that rely on intact and diverse habitat, good lateral connectivity, and a natural flow regime. Next slide, please. So based on this definition, we gathered data sets and we estimated a floodplain alteration index able to capture this overall degree of alteration of the floodplains. And we considered three different components. Next. The first one was to consider the degree of alteration of the habitat. And to do that, we use a human modification index that estimates the spatial extent and intensity of various threats, including agricultural uses, urbanization, and the presence of transportation infrastructure such as roads within floodplains. Next. Then we consider the degree of alteration of lateral connectivity due to the presence of artificial levees. And to do that, we consider the percentage of floodplain area that has been altered by the presence of artificial levees. And we also consider the density of levees within floodplains. Next. And lastly, we consider the degree of alteration of the natural flow regimes using a hydrologic alteration index that was previously developed, and that estimates the alteration of different facets of the natural flow regimes. And so we took these three indicators and we aggregated them into a cumulative index of floodplain alteration that varies between 0, indicating no alteration, to 100, indicating a high degree of alteration. Next. And so here is what we found. You have represented this floodplain alteration index with the color scale varying from 0, indicating a very low degree of floodplain alteration, to pinkish colors, indicating a high degree of alteration. And I think it's pretty clear, like just looking at this map, that we found that most of the floodplains in the US are in an altered state. If you look at the lower states, you cannot almost see these grayish colors, right? And so we found that in Alaska and Hawaii, the degree of alteration was relatively low, but was overall like very prevalent in the country. Next. And so it's possible to summarize these numbers a little bit. And what we did was just to consider like 4 categories of alteration corresponding to the same colors again: the low degree of protection, moderate degree of protection, high and very high, and to calculate what was like the number of floodplains like falling within these different like categories. And so here you have the numbers for the entire US on the left, and on the right for only the contiguous US. And so we found that more than 70% of the floodplains in the US are in a significant altered like state. And this number being even higher for the contiguous US, we found that more than 90% of the floodplains present a significant degree of alteration. And if we look at these categories here, and we want to consider only the high and very high degree of alteration, we found that the majority of the floodplains, especially in the lower states, are in high or very altered like states, which is obviously concerning. Next. And again, we can look at these numbers per state. And here you have on the y-axis like the degree of floodplain area being in these different categories of floodplain alteration. And so at the bottom, you have the different states. And so as you can see, we found that on the left, Alaska and Hawaii present like most of the floodplain area in a low degree of alteration, but most of the other states, they display more than half of their floodplains in a high or very high altered states, these like pinkish colors. And if you look even at the states represented on the right side of this like bar graph with the little stars, these are the states that display like more than half of their floodplain area in a very high altered state. And you have states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So, having collected the information regarding the degree of protection and alteration, came the question of what is then the intersection of current floodplain protection and alteration. And here are represented the results, and we have the degree of protection represented by the bluish colors. Okay, so the total percentage of floodplain area being protected. And you have on the pinkish colors, again, the degree of alteration. And so, oh, sorry, can you go back? Yeah. And so what we found that, like, what you can see is like, if it's pink, it means that there's both a high degree of alteration, but a low degree of protection. If it's blue, it means a high degree of protection and low degree of alteration. And when it's white, the two are low. But if it's like purple, it means that there's a high degree of protection and a high degree of alteration. So looking at this map, we see it's dominated by pink colors, right? Which means that we knew that before. There's overall a low degree of protection, but a high degree of alteration. But what is reassuring is that overall we found that higher floodplain protection is associated with a lower degree of alteration, which means that overall, protection is effective. in limiting the threat to floodplains. But that being said, we can see that there are many watersheds that are represented by purple colors on the map. We can see that along the East Coast. We can see that in areas of California and in the Pacific Northwest. And these are the well-protected watersheds that presents more than 50% of the floodplain area being protected. The majority of them also display a significant degree of alteration. Next slide. So to sum up, what we found with this assessment was that 22% of America's floodplains and 17% of the floodplains in the contiguous US are afforded some protection. That 73% and 92%, if we consider again the contiguous US, display a significant degree of alteration. And that even if protection does limit alteration of floodplains, 54% of watersheds with a high degree of floodplain protection are also significantly altered, which points to the need for restoration efforts of the floodplains within but outside of protected areas too. Okay, and so I just wanted to mention that we have developed a beta version of the Functional Floodplains Explorer that will allow to look at this data and to look at the degree of protection and alteration at various spatial scales in the US, and that this Explorer will be released soon. So if we have time, I can give a quick demo, just a couple of minutes, if it's okay. So let me share my screen. Oh. Perfect. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes. It worked. Okay, perfect. So here you have the functional floodplains Explorer, and there will be information regarding the methods and all the details about the data sources. But so entering into the Explorer, it allows to see the overall degree of protection, with each watershed being presented with a different color, indicating this total degree of protection. And within the Explorer, it's possible to also have a better understanding of the degree of protection and alteration for different states. For example, here, we can search for particular state of county. I'm going to zoom on the state of Illinois. And so it's possible to look at this degree of protection. It's also possible to change and look at the degree of floodplain alteration. So not surprisingly, for Illinois, we find that the degree of total protection is overall low. So it's dominated by the yellow colors with very few watersheds presenting a high degree of alteration. If we switch the view to the degree of alteration, we can see that the degree of alteration is pretty prevalent, especially around urban areas you have here Chicago. But then it's also possible to have information regarding the summary here of the states. We can see that for the state of Illinois, the main mechanism of protection are the conservation easement and the state conservation areas, and that, as we've just seen, the degree of floodplain alteration is very high. We can then zoom on particular watersheds, and we can even display the streams and rivers to have a better understanding of where we are. We can also look at the floodplains, and it's then possible to look at a particular watershed to have information regarding the mechanisms of protection. So here, the state conservation areas is the dominant mechanism of protection. And we also have different contextual variables, a breakdown of the floodplain alteration index, but also information regarding the flood risk for this particular watershed, the aquatic biodiversity, and the degree of river protection. And it allows to have a link to another web tool that we developed, but focusing on rivers. And it's possible to move out and then to have a series of sliders here that allows to filter watersheds based on the combination of threats. We can select the most altered like watershed within the United States, but also the ones presenting, for example, the highest like degree of flood risk, as well as the highest like biodiversity. And so based on this like expert, it will be possible to identify opportunities for restoration and future protection. I'm done. Aileen, back to you.
All right, hold on 1 second. I'll share my screen.
All right. I see a lot of asks for the a link to the Floodplains Explorer in the chat, so we'll drop that. We are still in beta form, making a few more tweaks and whatnot, but it is available. So we'll drop that for folks. And if you have any comments or thoughts, or if experience any glitches, then please do let us know, so we can make any last adjustments as we're finishing that up. But the last thing I wanted to just touch on before we wrap up is that the next topic we're looking at, or that we are gathering some data on, is trying to understand how much floodplain has been restored within the United States and what are those annual trends. Next slide. Many of you are probably familiar with American River's annual updates on dam removals across the country. So we have a network of folks in many of the different state agencies that are involved in dam removals that track how many projects are implemented every year. So we have really good trends over the last 30 years or so of, well, they go further back than that, but over the last few decades, especially, we've seen a lot more dam removals occur. And so we've been able to see the growth in that practice as a river restoration technique. So we're looking to gather the same sort of trend data in order to more effectively tell the story of that lateral connectivity of rivers in addition to the longitudinal connectivity. So we are currently in the process, also with conservation science partners, of gathering the various databases and information that is out there so that we can pull information on these different projects and make some determinations of which river restoration projects actually would count as floodplain restoration, which is very, very difficult to do, but we're trying to figure out a methodology that would work. So more information on that down the road. But next slide. If you have information on different sources, we would love to know what resources you have, that inventories of different restoration projects that would be useful for this exercise. Believe that QR code should take you to the Google form that would allow you to input that, or you could reach out to myself, Lacey, or Elise to share that information. So with that, I think that sums us up. I'm going to drop the link to the I'm going to drop a link to the Floodplain Explorer in the chat, if I can get it to work to everybody, or in the Q&A, and then we'd be happy to take any questions. But before we do, I would just like to say thank you to the funders of this floodplain assessment. FEMA has supported some of this work through their Cooperating Technical Partners program, and the James M. Cox Foundation has been hugely supportive of this work. So I will end there, and I think we can move on to questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eileen and Lise. That was a lot of awesome information. And we have a lot of questions. So I will start from the top. Sarah is asking, will the analysis be updated to reflect the proposed changes to the roadless rule for national forests?
Lisa, you might be able to answer this as well, but my understanding is this isn't a data set that we're going to be able to update sort of super regularly based on every change that might occur. And at this point in time, with all of the changes happening at the federal level, I think it's probably wise to wait for the dust to settle and then make some determinations of whether there are big changes that would necessitate sort of going back in and removing different categories of protections. But part of our effort in undertaking this, at least from the floodplains perspective, is that there's no federal agency that is charged with tracking the health of the nation's floodplains as a functional ecosystem. So we had been working with advocating for the National Nature Assessment that had been moving forward under the Biden administration, had been talking to FEMA about figuring out how we develop a mechanism for federal agencies to track floodplain health. That all has kind of come to a halt at the moment, but hopefully we'd be able to pick that up again and ensure that we're incorporating this sort of river data into national data efforts.
Thank you, Eileen. Okay, Beth asks, why are state parks listed in both Category 2 and Category 3?
I can take this one. So it is just because not all the state parks are equal, and some of them have been, so this is not our decision to, this is an assessment from like the USGS, and the information that is actually from the state or all the agencies like managing the lands. And so it's just because they are not all equal. And so we use this information to categorize them into like multiple use lands or protected areas, but this is not our decision. So it's really like how these parks are being managed.
That's helpful. Thank you. Moving on to Erin, is there a way to get the state-by-state statistics for the protected floodplains?
Yeah, Erin, if you're able to get into the Floodplains Explorer, you can search for a particular state and generate the state summary. If you're looking for data on all states, that's something we can pull together. We haven't pulled this together in a way that I can share right now yet, but that is something we'd be more than happy to do and then distribute to folks.
Awesome. Thank you, Eileen. Okay, Andrew asks, how did you determine the alteration indexes? Meaning, how did you determine each of those factors? The data being that seems like there's some typos, I'm working through it. Like it would significantly alter the results. For instance, in Pennsylvania, we find that most data does not reflect that nearly all streams were dammed, strengthened, or dredged for water power and transportation of goods, even our state and federal forests.
That's a very good question. I think all the assessments, like they come with limits, and the fact that it is a national assessment probably comes with caveats, meaning like at the very local scale, we might not be able to capture like all the degree of alterations that are taking place, especially because we know that alteration is also something that varies like through time. And so that's like the degree of protection, right? There are like changes to the amount of like protected floodplains, but the degree of alteration can also change through time. We did our best to gather information, really capturing alteration of many different facets of floodplains. And I think here the question like targets really the degree of like the special footprint of human activities like within floodplains. We did use like an integrative like index that has been developed at relatively like fine spatial scale. And so that consider like many different like activities. So it does consider like the amount of agricultural lands, the degree of urbanization, the presence of roads, although it might be missing perhaps like small trails, but it does consider like roads, like railroads, whether like mining activities are taking place. It does capture like the spatial footprint of dams. But again, these like data sets are based on other like, on the information that is available. So if some dams, for example, haven't been like inventoried, then we may miss them like at a very like local scale. But overall, I believe that they provide a good like assessment like of the degree of overall alteration due to these many like different human activities.
Awesome, thank you. Susan asked, very similar. Could you describe how you determine the very high, and moderate alteration?
Yeah, of course, like, sorry, I wasn't clear about that. So we define this index that is a relative index between like 0 and 100 once we consider all these different components of alteration. And then we just like split the index between like categories between 0 and 25, and we consider that it was a low degree of alteration, between 25 and 50, a moderate degree of alteration, 50 to 75, a high degree of alteration, and beyond 75, sorry, a very high degree of alteration. So it was just based on the values of the index, so the relative degree of alteration.
Okay, on the same theme, the next question is, when assessing alterations, did you evaluate the removed dams and that their historic floodplain sediment has likely been removed to restore connection to the floodplain?
We did not consider like dam removal in our assessment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Paul asks, in this weakened federal regulatory state, what are some successful floodplain protection strategies against further development, resource extraction, and alteration in floodplains?
Well, that's a light question. Yeah, Paul, that's something, we are thinking a lot about. With weakened federal regulations, for better or worse, many of us have to turn to the states and local communities to fill the gap. So one of the things that we are looking towards at American Rivers is, what are the current state of state floodplain management regulations and programs? Do states have their own standards about floodplain development, their own permitting processes and requirements? Do they have their own funding mechanisms that can support floodplain protection and restoration projects? Those sorts of activities. Who knows what is going to happen at the federal level over the next 3 years or 3 decades in terms of what can be put in place. But I think one of the areas where no matter what happens at the federal level, urging states to fill in at this point in time makes a lot of sense, so that no matter what happens at the federal level, that we still are able to protect remaining floodplain and invest in restoration. I do also think the sort of financial institutions are going to play more and more of a role in dictating floodplain development in terms of, where banks are going to be backing mortgages, what insurance is available. There's pluses and minuses to relying on those financial systems to make those decisions. But we are seeing more and more signs that they don't want to invest in risky development. Yeah, so there's a lot left to question, but that's the direction that we're looking right now. Brandon is leading our state level work on our team. So I don't know, Brandon, if you have anything specific you wanted to mention, but that's we're looking to the states and trying to help states to strengthen in the absence of federal regulatory conditions.
Thanks so much, Eileen, for answering that very light, easy to answer question. Okay, so the next question is, how are you connected to the new NNA, the UBN effort? Are any of you authors, will this be incorporated?
So I think that question's looking at, I think that's the National Nature Assessment that I had mentioned before. I'm guessing that's what that is. If that's still moving forward in any capacity and this could be included, then we'd be more than happy to talk with the organizers and the writers. We had made recommendations early on in the process that floodplain should be included at in some capacity. My understanding was that effort had been halted under this administration, but if there's updated information, be more than happy to talk.
Okay, Aaron asks, is there any incorporation for the base level engineering data to the floodplain extent?
I think that question, Lisa, is getting at how did we define the floodplain? So maybe you could talk a little bit about the how we define the floodplain for this versus the FEMA special flood hazard area incorporation.
Yeah, so we use an algorithm like to identify, like to define like the floodplain extent that was calibrated based on the FEMA maps. The problem is that these maps are available only for like 2/3 of the country. And so there were like many gaps. And so that's a very like relatively like easy to use like algorithm that is based on like topographic like rules instead of a hydrologic like complex like model, but that showed like very good results for at least like the lower states. And so it's based on the elevation and it's also based on the amount of water like coming in at a certain point of the network. So we use like a definition of like model floodplains, knowing that the model was trained based on the FEMA maps for each hydrologic region, like independently.
Thanks, Lise. The next one's asking about a cloud seeding question, which maybe was in the chat and I didn't see. I will point folks also to in the Q&A pop-up window, there's open questions at the top, and then kind of grayed out next to it, you see answered questions. Oh, I do see dismissed. So this is a new function for folks. So if you're not familiar, that's where all of those are. The next question is about getting a recording for the presentation. Yes, the recording will be available within a week on the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance website. Please email me your interest. That would be the easiest way for me to get in touch with you if you're interested in getting a CEC credit. I'm still trying to verify with ASFPM about how many CECs this webinar will be worth. Okay, and then for impacts to floodplains by urban development, how is the data pulled, aerial imagery, or something else? Oh, one more thing before, I think this is our last question. If there are questions that we haven't been able to answer, I will be collecting them and we'll try to answer them in a follow-up email as well when I send a follow-up email. And I see that it is 4 o'clock. So maybe this last one we'll actually just, we'll send that in the follow-up email just to be respectful of everyone's time. If that's okay with the presenters. Okay, great. So thank you so much for all of these questions, really excellent questions, and deep gratitude for Elise and Eileen and Brandon for being here today, and for all of y'all for showing up. If there's anything we can do to support your work, please let us know. As part of the Natural Floodplain Functions Alliance, we would love to talk about how we can support. So hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye all.
Thank you.